6 months after the medal ceremony, Jake and Lisa Morrison had settled into a new routine that felt both familiar and different from their life before the attack. The physical wounds had healed completely, but the experience had changed them, both in ways they were still discovering. Lisa had returned to her work at the veterinary clinic with a renewed sense of purpose. She had started a support group for military spouses who had experienced crime or felt unsafe in their communities. The group met twice a month in the community center, and word had spread throughout the region about the resources and support it provided. "I never thought I'd be grateful for what happened to us," Lisa told the group during one of their meetings. "But seeing how we can help other families has made me realize that sometimes the worst experiences can lead to the most meaningful work." The Me support group had grown from 5 members to over 30, with participants coming from as far away as North Carolina to attend meetings. Lisa had also worked with local law enforcement to develop educational materials about common scams targeting military families. Jake had been promoted to lieutenant commander and was now training other special operations personnel in civilian threat assessment. His experience with the Cruz and Williams case had become a teaching example used throughout the Navy SEAL community. "The most important lesson," Jake would tell new recruits, "is that your training doesn't end when you leave the battlefield. The skills we learn in the military have applications in civilian life, especially when it comes to protecting our families and communities." The criminal network that had terrorized military families across 3 states was completely dismantled. Richard Stone, the former Army sergeant who had organized the operation, was serving a 30-year sentence in federal prison. Danny Cruz and Pete Williams were both incarcerated in different facilities, with no possibility of parole for at least 10 years. The FBI had used Jake's investigation methods as a model for training other agents in military family crime cases. Agent Karen Walsh had visited the naval base several times to discuss the case with military personnel and law enforcement officers. What Lieutenant Commander Morrison accomplished, Agent Walsh explained during one training session, was a perfect example of how military training can be applied to civilian law enforcement problems. His methodical approach and attention to detail allowed us to build cases that resulted in convictions for the entire criminal network. Jake's success had also led to changes in how the military prepared families for deployments. New training programs now included information about common scams and crimes targeting military spouses, along with resources for reporting suspicious activity. The Morrison family had received hundreds of letters from other military families thanking them for their role in stopping the criminal network. Many of the letters came from families who had been victimized by Cruz, Williams, and their associates. One letter that particularly moved Lisa came from a woman in North Carolina whose husband had been deployed when the fake HOA officers robbed her home. "Before your husband caught those criminals," the woman wrote, "I was afraid to stay alone in my house when my husband was deployed. I was planning to move back in with my parents every time he had to leave. Now I feel safe again, and my children can grow up in the home we chose for them. Thank you for giving us our life back." Jake kept that letter in his desk at work, reading it whenever he needed to remember why his work mattered. The neighborhood of Pinewood Heights had also changed for the better. The real HOA board had implemented new security measures and communication protocols to prevent criminals from impersonating official representatives. Neighbors were more connected and looked out for each other in ways they had not before. Mrs. Chen had become one of Lisa's closest friends, often bringing homemade Korean food to the Morrison house and helping with the support group meetings. The elderly woman who had once been too frightened to call for help when she saw Lisa being attacked was now one of the most active members of the Neighborhood Watch program. "Fear makes us weak," Mrs. Chen told Lisa one afternoon as they worked together in Lisa's garden. "But courage makes us strong, and your family showed all of us what courage looks like." The garden that had started the whole confrontation with the fake HOA officers had become a symbol of resilience for the community. Lisa had expanded it significantly, and neighbors often stopped by to admire the flowers and vegetables she grew. Jake had helped her build raised beds and install a small irrigation system, turning the garden into a beautiful space that brought them both peace and satisfaction. They spent many evenings working together in the garden, talking about their days and planning for the future. Do you ever regret how we handled the situation? Lisa asked Jake one evening as they watered the tomatoes. No, Jake replied without hesitation. We did the right thing. Those men are in prison where they belong, and dozens of families are safe because of our actions. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if you had just scared them off instead of building a case against them. They would have just moved to a different area and started victimizing new families. By gathering evidence and working with the FBI, we made sure they couldn't hurt anyone else. Lisa nodded, knowing Jake was right. The systematic approach he had taken had been more difficult and time-consuming than simple revenge, but it had achieved lasting results that protected other families. I'm proud of us, she said, taking Jake's hand. We turned something terrible into something positive. As summer turned to fall, Jake received news about his next assignment. The Navy wanted to send him to California to help establish a new training program for special operations personnel. The assignment would last 2 years and would allow Lisa to transfer to a veterinary practice in San Diego. It's a good opportunity, Jake told Lisa as they discussed the move. And San Diego has great weather for gardening. Will we be able to keep doing the support group work? California has a huge military population. I'm sure there's a need for the kind of support you provide. Lisa smiled at the thought of starting fresh in a new place while continuing the work that had given her life new meaning. I think I'd like that. A new beginning, but carrying forward what we've learned. The night before they were scheduled to leave for California, the neighborhood threw a farewell party for the Morrison family. Nearly every resident of Pinewood Heights attended, along with many of the military families Lisa had helped through her support group. Captain Rodriguez presented Jake with a letter of commendation for his civilian service, while the HOA board gave Lisa a plaque recognizing her contributions to community safety and support. The Morrison family represents the best of what military families can be, Mrs. Patterson, the HOA president, said during the ceremony. They faced a terrible situation with courage and determination, and they used their experience to help others. We're going to miss them, but we know they'll make their new community stronger. As Jake and Lisa packed their belongings the next morning, they found themselves looking through photo albums and mementos from their time in Virginia. There were pictures from Jake's deployments, their wedding, and holidays with family. But there were also newer photos from the medal ceremony, the support group meetings and neighborhood gatherings. 2 weeks after the arrest of Danny Cruz and Pete Williams, FBI Special Agent Karen Walsh called Jake with an update on the federal investigation. Lieutenant Commander Morrison, I wanted to let you know that your evidence has led to the biggest breakthrough we've had in military family fraud cases. We've made 17 arrests across 3 states based on the information you provided. Jake was at home with Lisa, who was finally able to use her wrist normally again. The bruises on her face had faded, and she was beginning to feel safe in their own home again. How many victims were involved? Jake asked. 63 confirmed families with total losses exceeding $400,000. The criminal network was much larger and more organized than we initially realized. Lisa moved closer to Jake so she could hear the conversation. The scope of the criminal operation still amazed her, and she felt grateful that Jake had been able to stop it. What about the storage units? Jake asked. Jake, we recovered stolen property from all 5 locations Cruz and Williams told you about, plus 3 additional units we discovered through the network investigation. We've been able to return items to most of the victims. Agent Walsh paused before continuing. There's something else you should know. The leader of this criminal network was a man named Richard Stone, a former Army sergeant who was dishonorably discharged for theft. He specifically targeted military families because he understood deployment schedules and knew when spouses would be alone and vulnerable. Where is Stone now? In federal custody in North Carolina. He was arrested 3 days ago when he tried to flee the country. Your evidence provided the key connections that allowed us to identify him and freeze his assets. Jake felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that the mastermind behind the attacks on military families was now facing justice. Stone had betrayed everything the military stood for by using his knowledge to prey on the people he had once sworn to protect. What are the charges? Jake asked. Stone is facing federal charges for organized criminal activity, conspiracy to Commit fraud, money laundering, and violation of federal laws protecting military families. He's looking at 25 to 30 years in prison without the possibility of parole. And Cruz and Williams? They accepted plea bargains in exchange for their cooperation against Stone and the other network members. 15 years each in federal prison. They'll be eligible for parole in 10 years if they maintain good behavior. Lisa squeezed Jake's hand. The men who had attacked her would spend the next decade behind bars, unable to hurt any other families. There's one more thing, Agent Walsh continued. The Department of Defense wants to recognize your role in breaking up this criminal network. They're considering you for a civilian service commendation. That's not necessary, Jake replied. I was just protecting my family. Nevertheless, what you accomplished saved dozens of families from becoming victims, and it shut down a criminal operation that had been frustrating law enforcement for years. The military takes care of its own, and that includes recognizing those who go above and beyond to protect military families. After Jake hung up, he and Lisa sat together on their couch, finally able to relax completely for the first time since the attack. I still can't believe how organized they were, Lisa said. They had been planning this for years. Military training can be used for good or evil, Jake replied. Stone chose to use his knowledge to hurt people instead of helping them. That's what made him especially dangerous. Do you think we'll ever see any of the other criminals? No. They'll all be in federal prison for years, and when they get out, they'll be on probation with strict restrictions. None of them will be allowed near military installations or housing areas. Lisa leaned against Jake's shoulder. I'm proud of how you handled this. You could have just beaten them up and called it even, but you made sure they faced real justice. Violence should always be the last resort, not the first. These men needed to face the legal system so they couldn't hurt anyone else. The next day, Jake returned to work at the naval base where news of his role in the federal investigation had spread throughout his unit. Chief Petty Officer Torres approached him during the morning briefing. Morrison, I heard you took down an entire criminal network while I was just lending you surveillance equipment. It was a team effort, Chief. The evidence gathering was just as important as the arrests. The captain wants to see you in his office after the briefing. I think you're going to like what he has to say. Captain Rodriguez was waiting for Jake, with a smile and a letter in his hand. Morrison, I just received this from the Department of Defense. You're being awarded the Defense of Freedom Medal for your role in protecting military families from criminal activity. Jake read the letter, which detailed his investigation and the resulting arrests. The medal was rarely given to active duty personnel for civilian actions, making it a significant honor. Sir, I appreciate the recognition, but I was just doing what any husband would do to protect his wife. No, Morrison. What you did required the kind of training and dedication that very few people possess. You used your military skills to serve your community and protect vulnerable families. That's exactly what we hope all our service members will do. Captain Rodriguez stood and shook Jake's hand. The ceremony will be next month. Make sure your wife is there to see you receive this honor. When Jake told Lisa about the medal that evening, she insisted on calling her sister Sarah and her parents to share the good news. I'm so proud of you, she said after finishing her phone calls. You turned something terrible into something that helped so many people. We turned it into something positive, Jake corrected. You were brave enough to tell me what happened and trust me to handle it the right way. Without that, Cruz and Williams would still be out there hurting other families. A month later, Jake stood in dress uniform at the naval base as Captain Rodriguez presented him with the Defense of Freedom Medal. Lisa watched from the audience, wearing the pearl necklace that had been returned to her after the arrests. In his acceptance speech, Jake thanked his fellow service members and emphasized that protecting military families was everyone's responsibility. The men and women who serve our country make sacrifices that most civilians never have to face, Jake said. Their families also serve, often enduring long separations and the constant worry that comes with having a loved one in harm's way. When criminals target these families, they attack the very foundation of our military's strength. Jake looked at Lisa in the audience before continuing. Our military families deserve to feel safe in their communities. They deserve to know that their neighbors and their government will protect them from those who would take advantage of their service and sacrifice. After the ceremony, several other military families approached Jake and Lisa to thank them for their role in stopping the criminal network. Amy Rodriguez, the woman with the baby whom Jake had helped after witnessing her robbery, was among those in attendance. Lieutenant Commander Morrison, I wanted to thank you again for what you did. Because of your actions, my family feels safe again. That's what we fight for, Jake replied. To make sure families like yours can live without fear. As they drove home from the ceremony, Lisa reflected on how much their lives had changed since that terrible morning when Cruz and Williams had attacked her. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't come home early that day? She asked. Those men would have kept victimizing families until someone else stopped them, Jake said. I'm just glad it was me who had the chance to put an end to their crimes. And I'm glad I married a man who knows how to keep his promises. Jake smiled and took Lisa's hand as they drove through their neighborhood. Pinewood Heights looked the same as always, with its perfect lawns and identical mailboxes. But now it felt truly safe again, protected by neighbors who looked out for each other, and a community that would not tolerate criminals who preyed on the vulnerable. The real victory was not the medal or the recognition. The real victory was that Lisa could work in her garden without fear, that Amy Rodriguez could raise her baby in peace, and that dozens of other military families could sleep safely in their homes, knowing that the predators who had stalked them were behind bars where they belonged. Jake had kept his promise to protect his wife, but in doing so, he had also protected an entire community. That was a legacy he could be proud of for the rest of his life. Jake arrived at the abandoned Sears parking lot 15 minutes before the scheduled meeting time. The location was perfect for his purposes, isolated enough for privacy, but visible enough that Cruz and Williams would not suspect an ambush. He parked his truck facing the entrance and waited. At exactly the appointed time, Cruz's sedan pulled into the lot. Jake could see both men in the front seats looking nervous and constantly checking their mirrors. Jake stepped out of his truck and walked to the center of the parking lot, standing in a position where he could see all approaches. Cruz and Williams got out of their car slowly, Cruz carrying a cardboard box and Williams holding a manila folder. You came alone like I asked, Jake observed. That was smart. We brought everything, Cruz said, setting the box on the ground between them. Your wife's jewelry, the cash we took, and some other stuff from your house. Jake opened the box and saw Lisa's wedding ring, her pearl necklace, and several other pieces of jewelry that had belonged to her grandmother. There was also $800 in cash and a few small electronics they had stolen. What about the list of your associates and victims? Jake asked. Williams handed him the manila folder. Everything's in there. Names, addresses, dates, what we took from each house. The whole operation. Jake opened the folder and quickly scanned the contents. There were dozens of names and addresses, along with detailed records of what had been stolen from each family. The scope of the criminal operation was larger than Jake had realized. How many storage units? Jake asked. 5 in total, Cruz answered. 2 in Norfolk, 2 in Virginia Beach, and 1 in Portsmouth. The keys are in the box with your stuff. Jake nodded, satisfied that they were telling the truth. Fear had made them cooperative, and their eagerness to get away from him was obvious. Now for the important part, Jake said, his voice becoming harder. I want you to understand something very clearly. This conversation is being recorded, and copies of everything you've given me are already in safe hands. If anything happens to me or my family, that evidence goes straight to the FBI. Both men nodded quickly, sweat visible on their foreheads despite the cool morning air. I also want you to know that I lied about giving you 24 hours to leave town, Jake continued. I've already contacted the authorities and they'll be picking you up within the hour. Cruz and Williams looked at each other in panic. You said you'd let us go if we cooperated, Williams protested. I said I might let you disappear quietly. But after seeing the list of families you've victimized, I changed my mind. You've hurt too many people to be allowed to continue your crimes somewhere else. Cruz started to back toward his car, but Jake's voice stopped him. I wouldn't try to run if I were you. My friends are already watching your known associates, your apartments, and the highways leading out of town. The only way this ends well for you is if you surrender peacefully when the police arrive." "This isn't fair," Williams said desperately. "We gave you everything you wanted." "Fair?" Jake's voice was filled with controlled anger. "Was it fair when you shoved my wife against a wall and injured her wrist? Was it fair when you threatened to come back and hurt her again? Was it fair when you terrorized dozens of other military families?" Jake stepped closer to both men, and they instinctively backed away. "You picked the wrong family to victimize, gentlemen. You thought you could prey on a military wife while her husband was deployed, but you made one critical mistake." "What mistake?" Cruz asked weakly. "You assumed that because I wasn't there to protect her the first time, I wouldn't be able to find you and make you pay for hurting her. You forgot that Navy SEALs are trained to hunt down enemies wherever they hide." In the distance, Jake could hear sirens approaching. Cruz and Williams heard them too, and their faces went pale. "Here's what's going to happen," Jake said calmly. "You're going to put your hands behind your heads and wait for the police to arrive. You're going to cooperate fully with their investigation, and you're going to plead guilty to all charges, rather than putting your victims through the trauma of testifying at trial." "And if we don't?" Cruz asked, though he was already putting his hands behind his head. "Then I'll testify at your trial about this conversation, and I'll make sure the judge knows exactly what kind of predators you are. Federal judges don't like criminals who target military families, and they tend to give maximum sentences." 3 Norfolk police cars pulled into the parking lot with lights flashing. Jake recognized his friend Tony Rodriguez getting out of the lead car, along with several other officers Jake had worked with on previous cases. "Jake, are these our suspects?" Tony called out as the officers approached with weapons drawn. "Danny Cruz and Pete Williams," Jake confirmed. "They've just confessed to multiple home invasions and provided evidence of their entire criminal operation." The officers quickly handcuffed both men while Tony walked over to Jake. "Did they resist arrest?" "No resistance at all. They were very cooperative once they realized they had been caught." Tony looked at the box of stolen goods and the manila folder Jake was holding. "Is that evidence?" "Everything you need to prosecute them and their associates. Detailed records of dozens of robberies, keys to storage units full of stolen property, and a complete list of victims who are willing to testify." As Cruz and Williams were loaded into police cars, Cruz called out to Jake, "This isn't over. We have friends who'll come looking for you." Jake walked over to the police car and leaned down to the window. "Tell your friends that Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, United States Navy SEALs, will be waiting for them, and remind them what happened to the last criminals who threatened my family." Cruz said nothing more, but Jake could see the fear in his eyes as the police car drove away. Tony walked back to Jake as the scene was being secured. "How did you find these guys so fast?" "I've been tracking them since they attacked Lisa. They're part of a larger network that's been targeting military families throughout the region. The FBI is going to want to talk to you about that network," Tony said. "This could be the break. They've been looking for in a case that's been frustrating them for months. I'll cooperate fully with the investigation. I want to make sure all of these criminals go to prison for a long time." Jake handed Tony the box of stolen property and the manila folder. "Everything they stole from my house is in the box. The folder contains evidence of their entire operation, including storage unit locations and victim lists." "This is incredible work, Jake. Most people would have just called the police after the initial attack." "Most people aren't married to Navy SEALs," Jake replied. "These men made the mistake of thinking they could hurt my wife and get away with it." As the police finished processing the scene, Jake called Lisa to let her know that Cruz and Williams had been arrested and would not be bothering them again. "Is it really over?" Lisa asked. "It's over. They're in custody, and they'll be going to federal prison. You're safe now, and so are all the other families they were targeting." "When will you be home?" "I need to stop by the FBI office to give them the evidence about the larger criminal network, but I should be home by dinner." Jake spent the next 4 hours at the federal building, providing detailed information about everything he had discovered. The FBI agents were impressed by the quality of his investigation and told him that his evidence would help them shut down criminal operations in 3 states. You did law enforcement work that would have taken us months to accomplish, Special Agent Karen Walsh told him. Your military training really showed in how you approached this case. I just wanted to protect my family and make sure these criminals couldn't hurt anyone else, Jake replied. Well, you accomplished both goals. Cruz and Williams are looking at 10 to 15 years in federal prison, and their associates will be arrested within the next few days. When Jake finally arrived home, that evening Lisa was waiting for him with her wedding ring back on her finger and tears in her eyes. Thank you, she said, embracing him tightly. Thank you for bringing my ring back and for making sure they can't hurt us again. I told you I would protect you, Jake said, holding her close. I meant every word of that promise. That night, as they lay in bed together, Lisa asked Jake what had happened during his confrontation with Cruz and Williams. I convinced them that cooperating with the authorities was in their best interest, Jake said simply. How did you convince them? Jake smiled in the darkness. I explained the situation to them in terms they could understand. Lisa knew there was more to the story, but she also knew that her husband had handled the situation in exactly the right way. The men who had hurt her were in prison, their criminal network was being dismantled, and other military families would be safe from their predatory behavior. Most importantly, Jake had kept his promise to protect her, and she knew that no one would ever be foolish enough to threaten their family again. Jake returned home that evening to find Lisa waiting for him with dinner prepared, and her wrist feeling slightly better. She had spent the day at her sister Sarah's house as Jake had requested, but came home when he called to say it was safe. How did your research go? Lisa asked as they sat down to eat. I learned a lot about our visitors. They're part of a bigger operation that's been targeting military families across the region. I have enough evidence to put them away for a long time. Are you going to call the police now? Jake cut into his steak and considered his answer carefully. Soon. But first I want to make sure they understand that they can never come back here or bother you again. Lisa studied her husband's face. She could see the cold determination in his eyes that reminded her why other countries feared American Special Forces soldiers. Jake, what are you planning? Nothing that will get me in trouble with the law. But these men threatened you, and they threatened to come back. I need to have a conversation with them to make sure they understand that would be a very bad idea. Please be careful, I don't want to lose you because of this. Jake reached across the table and took her good hand. You're not going to lose me. I've been in much more dangerous situations than dealing with a couple of small-time criminals. Trust me. That night, Jake lay awake planning his approach while Lisa slept beside him. He had identified a pattern in Cruz and Williams's behavior that he could exploit. Every morning, they met at Murphy's Tavern to plan their day's activities. Every evening, they returned to the same bar to drink and count their money from the day's robberies. Jake also knew that both men lived alone and had no close family members who would worry if they disappeared for a few hours. This gave him the opportunity he needed to have an uninterrupted conversation with them. The next morning, Jake told Lisa he was going to the base for training exercises and would be home late. He kissed her goodbye and drove to Norfolk, where he set up surveillance on Murphy's Tavern. At 9:30, Cruz and Williams arrived at the bar in Cruz's sedan. Jake watched as they went inside, probably to plan which neighborhood they would target that day. He had studied their pattern and knew they would emerge around 10:15 to begin their criminal activities. Jake positioned his truck in the parking lot where he could intercept them when they came out. He had changed into civilian clothes and carried no weapons, relying instead on the combat skills that had made him one of the Navy's most elite warriors. At exactly 10:16, Cruz and Williams walked out of the bar toward Cruz's car. Jake approached them from behind, moving silently on the gravel parking lot. Danny Cruz and Pete Williams, Jake said when he was 10 feet away. Both men turned around, and Jake saw recognition flash in their eyes. Cruz's hand moved toward his jacket pocket, but Jake was already moving. In 3 quick steps, Jake closed the distance between them. He grabbed Cruz's wrist before the criminal could draw whatever weapon he was reaching for, applying pressure to a nerve point that made Cruz cry out in pain and drop a small knife. Williams tried to run, but Jake swept his legs and sent him crashing to the ground. Within seconds, both men were face down on the gravel with Jake kneeling between them, one hand controlling each man's arm. "Gentlemen, we need to have a conversation about what happened at my house 2 days ago," Jake said calmly. "We don't know what you're talking about," Cruz gasped, his face pressed against the parking lot. Jake applied slightly more pressure to Cruz's arm, stopping just short of breaking bones. "Let me refresh your memory. Tuesday morning, you and your friend here broke into my home, assaulted my wife, and stole our property while claiming to be HOA enforcement officers. You can't prove anything," Williams said, struggling against Jake's grip. "Actually, I can prove quite a lot. I've spent the last 2 days documenting your criminal activities. I have photographs of you robbing other families, recordings of you, making threats and evidence linking you to multiple storage units full of stolen goods." Both men stopped struggling as they realized how much trouble they were in. "I also know that you're part of a larger criminal network that specifically targets military families," Jake continued. "I have the names and addresses of your associates, photos of your meetings, and records of your victims going back 18 months. What do you want?" Cruz asked quietly. "I want several things. First, I want you to understand that if you ever come near my wife or my home again, the conversation will not be as pleasant as this one. Second, I want you to return everything you stole from my house. Third, I want you to give me the locations of all your storage units and the names of everyone in your criminal network. And if we don't?" Williams tried to sound defiant, but his voice shook with fear. Jake leaned closer to Williams's ear. "Then I'll turn my evidence over to the police right now, and you'll spend the next 10 years in federal prison. The FBI is very interested in crimes against military families, and they tend to prosecute those cases aggressively." Jake released both men and stepped back, allowing them to sit up but ready to react if either tried anything stupid. "On the other hand," Jake continued, "if you cooperate with me, I might be willing to let you disappear quietly before the police get involved. That would give you a chance to start over somewhere far away from here." Cruz and Williams looked at each other, silently communicating. Jake could see them weighing their options and realizing they had very few good choices. "How do we know you won't call the cops anyway?" Cruz asked. "Because I'm a man of my word. If you return what you stole from me and give me the information I want, I'll give you 24 hours to get out of Virginia before I contact the authorities. That's more than you deserve, but I'm willing to be generous if you cooperate." "And if we refuse?" Jake smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then we'll continue this conversation in a location where there are no witnesses and no security cameras. I've been to places where people disappear permanently, and I know how to make that happen." The threat was implied rather than explicit, but both criminals understood exactly what Jake was saying. They had picked the wrong family to victimize. Okay, Cruz said quickly. "We'll give you what you want, just don't hurt us." "Smart choice. Here's how this is going to work. You're going to take me to every storage unit you use, and you're going to show me everything you've stolen. Then you're going to give me a list of everyone in your network and every family you've robbed. Finally, you're going to return my wife's jewelry and our other property." Williams started to object, but Cruz cut him off. "We'll do it. Just give us the 24 hours like you promised." "I'm a man of my word," Jake repeated, "but understand this clearly. If I ever see either of you in Virginia again, if you ever contact my wife or any of the other families you've victimized, if you ever even think about coming back here, I will find you. And the next time we meet, I won't be as understanding as I am today." Jake handed Cruz a piece of paper with his phone number written on it. "You have 1 hour to gather everything I asked for. Call this number when you're ready and we'll arrange a meeting place. Don't try to run because I know where both of you live and I have friends watching your known associates." This was not entirely true, but Jake delivered the lie with such conviction that both criminals believed him completely. 1 hour, Jake repeated. "Don't be late." Jake walked back to his truck and drove away, leaving Cruz and Williams sitting in the parking lot of Murphy's Tavern. He knew they would cooperate because they were cowards who preyed on vulnerable people. When faced with someone who could fight back, they would fold immediately. Jake spent the next hour driving around Norfolk thinking about his next moves. He had no intention of letting Cruz and Williams simply disappear. They had hurt too many families to be allowed to continue their criminal activities somewhere else. But first, he wanted his wife's property back, and he wanted the information that would help the FBI destroy the entire criminal network. After that, Jake would contact his friend Tony at the Norfolk Police Department and turn over everything he had gathered. Cruz and Williams would go to prison where they belonged, and the other families they had victimized would get justice. But more importantly, Lisa would be safe, and she would know that her husband had kept his promise to protect her. Jake's phone rang exactly 1 hour after he had left the parking lot. Cruz's voice was shaky and defeated when he spoke. "We have everything you wanted. Where do you want to meet?" "The parking lot behind the old Sears store on Military Highway. Come alone and bring everything I asked for. We'll be there in 20 minutes. Jake smiled as he hung up the phone. Sometimes the best military strategy was the simplest one: find the enemy's weakness and exploit it ruthlessly. Cruz and Williams' weakness was that they were cowards, and Jake had used that against them perfectly. The next morning, Jake called in sick to work and began his hunt for Danny Cruz and Pete Williams. He had spent most of the night planning his approach while Lisa slept beside him, her injured wrist wrapped in a splint. Before leaving the house, Jake kissed Lisa goodbye and made her promise to keep the doors locked and not answer them for anyone she did not recognize. "Where are you going?" she asked, noting that he was dressed in civilian clothes instead of his uniform. "I'm going to do some research on our visitors from yesterday. I want to make sure they don't bother you or anyone else again." "Jake, please be careful. I don't want anything to happen to you because of this." "Nothing's going to happen to me," he assured her. "I'm just going to gather some information." Jake's first stop was the Norfolk equipment rental shop where he borrowed surveillance gear from his SEAL team leader, Chief Petty Officer Mike Torres. Torres did not ask many questions, but he made it clear that Jake needed to stay within legal boundaries. "Whatever you're planning, make sure it ends with these guys in jail, not you," Torres said as he handed over a small camera and listening device. "That's the plan, Chief." Jake drove to Portsmouth and found the apartment complex where Danny Cruz supposedly lived, according to the rental van registration. The building was a deteriorating 3-story structure with peeling paint and broken windows. Cars with expired tags and missing parts filled the parking lot. Jake parked across the street and settled in to watch the building. He had done surveillance missions in hostile territories around the world, so watching a rundown apartment complex in Portsmouth was easy by comparison. Around noon, he spotted Cruz walking out of the building. Jake recognized the tall, blonde man immediately from the criminal database photos. Cruz got into a beat-up Ford sedan and drove away, with Jake following at a safe distance. Cruz drove to a storage facility on the outskirts of Norfolk. Jake watched as Cruz opened unit number 47 and began loading boxes into his car. Even from a distance, Jake could see electronics and other items that looked like they had been recently stolen. Jake used his phone to take photos of Cruz loading the stolen goods, making sure to capture the storage unit number and license plates. This was evidence that could link Cruz to the robberies, but Jake needed more. After Cruz left the storage facility, Jake followed him to a pawn shop in downtown Norfolk. Cruz carried 2 boxes into the shop and emerged 20 minutes later with cash in his hand. Jake photographed the entire transaction and noted the name of the pawn shop. From the pawn shop, Cruz drove to Murphy's Tavern, the bar where Pete Williams was known to hang out. Jake parked down the street and watched as Cruz went inside. Through the window, he could see Cruz talking to a shorter man with dark hair who matched Williams's description. Jake needed to get closer to hear their conversation, but approaching the bar would be too risky. Instead, he decided to wait and see where they went next. An hour later, both men emerged from the bar and got into Cruz's car. Jake followed them through Norfolk traffic as they drove toward Virginia Beach. His heart rate increased as he realized they were heading in the direction of Pinewood Heights toward his neighborhood. Jake called Lisa on his hands-free phone system. "Lisa, I need you to go to your sister's house right now. Don't ask questions, just pack a bag and go. What's wrong? Are they coming back?" "I don't know, but I'm not taking any chances. Call me when you get to Sarah's house." Jake was relieved when Cruz and Williams drove past the turnoff to Pinewood Heights and continued toward the ocean front. They stopped at another apartment complex, this one in better condition than Cruz's building. Jake watched as the two men approached a ground-floor apartment and knocked on the door. A woman in her 30s answered, and Jake could see that she was holding a baby. Even from his position across the parking lot, Jake could tell the woman was frightened. The men pushed their way into the apartment, and Jake realized they were robbing another victim. He considered calling the police immediately, but he knew they would arrive too late to catch Cruz and Williams in the act. Instead, Jake moved closer to the apartment using parked cars for cover. He activated the small recording device Chief Torres had given him and approached the window near the front door. Through the thin walls, he could hear Cruz and Williams threatening the woman. "Where's your husband, lady?" Williams was saying. "He's deployed with the Air Force," the woman replied, her voice shaking. "He won't be back for 3 months." "Perfect. That gives us plenty of time to come back if you don't cooperate today," Cruz said. Jake recorded everything as the men demanded, money and valuables from the terrified woman. They were using the same techniques they had used on Lisa, claiming to be HOA enforcement officers and threatening to return if the victim reported them. "Please don't hurt my baby," the woman pleaded at one point. "Nobody's going to get hurt if you just give us what we want," Williams replied. Jake had to force himself to stay hidden and keep recording instead of charging through the front door. He needed evidence that would put these men in prison for years, not just an assault charge that would get them released in a few months. After 30 minutes, Cruz and Williams emerged from the apartment carrying a bag full of stolen items. The woman stood in her doorway holding her baby, tears streaming down her face as she watched them drive away. Jake approached the woman as soon as the criminals were gone. She was still shaking and initially refused to open the door when he knocked. "Ma'am, my name is Jake Morrison. I'm a Navy SEAL and I just witnessed those men rob you. Are you and your baby okay?" The woman, who introduced herself as Amy Rodriguez, slowly opened the door. "They said they were from the HOA. They had badges and everything." "They're not from any HOA. They're criminals who target military families. I have evidence of what they just did to you, and I'm going to make sure they go to prison." Jake showed Amy his military identification and explained that the same men had attacked his wife the day before. He convinced her to write down everything she remembered about the robbery while the details were still fresh in her memory. "Will you testify against them if they're arrested?" Jake asked. Amy looked at her baby and then back at Jake. "Yes. If it means they can't do this to other families, I'll testify." Jake gave Amy his phone number and the contact information for his friend, Tony at the Norfolk Police Department. Then he resumed following Cruz and Williams, who had driven to another storage facility on the other side of town. Jake watched as they stored Amy's stolen belongings in a different unit from the one Cruz had visited earlier. He photographed everything and noted the unit numbers, realizing that the criminals probably had multiple storage units full of stolen goods. As the afternoon wore on, Jake followed Cruz and Williams to 2 more apartments where they attempted their HOA scam. At one location, an elderly man refused to let them inside and threatened to call the police. Cruz and Williams left quickly, apparently unwilling to risk a confrontation with someone who was not intimidated by their act. At the second location, they successfully robbed a young woman whose husband was deployed with the Marines. Jake recorded the entire incident and approached the victim afterward, just as he had done with Amy Rodriguez. By evening, Jake had documented 3 separate robberies and had spoken to 2 victims who were willing to testify. He also had photos of 2 storage units full of stolen goods and recordings of the criminals making threats and admitting to their crimes. But Jake was not finished yet. He wanted to know more about the criminal network that Cruz and Williams worked for. He suspected they were not operating alone, and he wanted to identify everyone involved before contacting the police. Jake followed the 2 men back to Murphy's Tavern, where they met with 3 other men Jake did not recognize. He set up surveillance, from a position where he could photograph everyone who entered and left their meeting. Using his phone, Jake ran the license plates of the vehicles belonging to the other men. 2 of them had criminal records similar to Cruz and Williams, confirming that this was an organized operation rather than just 2 criminals working alone. Jake spent the next 4 hours documenting the criminal network's activities. He learned that they had been targeting military housing areas throughout Virginia and North Carolina, using multiple scams to victimize dozens of families. As the evening ended and the criminals went their separate ways, Jake realized he had enough evidence to destroy their entire operation. But before he contacted the police, he wanted to send Cruz and Williams a personal message about what happened when someone hurt his wife. Jake had been patient and methodical all day, gathering evidence like the professional soldier he was. But tomorrow Danny Cruz and Pete Williams were going to learn what happened when they messed with a Navy SEALs family. Jake tried calling Lisa 6 more times during his lunch break, each call going straight to voicemail. The cold feeling in his stomach grew stronger with each unanswered ring. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. He approached his commanding officer, Captain Rodriguez, during the afternoon break between meetings. "Sir, I need to request emergency leave to check on my wife. She sent me a concerning text this morning and hasn't answered her phone since." Captain Rodriguez looked at Jake's worried expression and nodded. "Go ahead, Morrison. Family comes first. We can finish your debriefing tomorrow." Jake drove home faster than he should have, his mind racing through worst-case scenarios. The text about aggressive HOA officers kept replaying in his head, along with the image of the white van he had seen that morning. When he pulled into his driveway at 3:30 in the afternoon, everything looked normal from the outside. The front door was closed, Lisa's car was in the garage, and nothing seemed disturbed. But Jake's military training had taught him that appearances could be deceiving. He used his key to enter through the front door, calling Lisa's name as he stepped inside. "Lisa, I'm home early." "In here," came her voice from the living room, but it sounded strange, weak and shaky. Jake found Lisa sitting on the couch with an ice pack on her left wrist and another on her cheek. When she looked up at him, he saw the bruising around her eye and the small bandage on her forehead. "Jesus Christ, Lisa, what happened?" Jake was beside her in 2 quick steps, gently taking her face in his hands to examine her injuries. "Those men came back," she said quietly. "The ones I told you about. The fake HOA officers. They did this to you?" Jake's voice was deadly calm, the same tone he used before going into combat. Lisa nodded, then told him everything that had happened. Jake listened without interrupting, his jaw getting tighter with each detail. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "Did you call the police?" he asked finally. "No. They threatened to come back if I called anyone. They said they knew your deployment schedule and would hurt me worse next time." Jake stood up and began pacing the living room, his hands clenched into fists. Lisa had seen him angry before, but never like this. There was something cold and dangerous in his eyes that reminded her that her husband was trained to kill people. "They're not coming back," Jake said quietly. "Ever. Jake, please don't do anything crazy. I don't want you to get in trouble because of this." He stopped pacing and knelt in front of her, taking her good hand in both of his. "Lisa, I swore an oath to protect this country and its people. But before that, I made a promise to you on our wedding day to protect you and keep you safe. Those men broke into our home and hurt my wife. That's not something I can let slide. What are you going to do?" "First, I'm going to take you to the hospital to get that wrist looked at. Then I'm going to find out exactly who these men are and make sure they never hurt anyone again." At the emergency room, the doctor confirmed that Lisa's wrist was badly sprained but not broken. She also had a mild concussion from hitting the wall. The doctor wanted to know how she got the injuries, and Lisa looked at Jake before answering. "I was attacked during a home invasion," she said simply. "Have you reported this to the police?" the doctor asked. "We're handling it," Jake replied before Lisa could answer. On the drive home, Jake was quiet while Lisa dozed from the pain medication the doctor had given her. His mind was working through the problem like he would plan a military operation. He needed intelligence about the enemy before he could take action. Back at the house, Jake helped Lisa to bed and then began his investigation. He started with the neighbors, knocking on doors and asking if anyone had seen the white van or the 2 men. Mrs. Chen answered her door nervously when Jake knocked. She was an elderly Korean woman who had lived in the neighborhood for 15 years. "Mrs. Chen, I'm Jake Morrison from across the street. Did you happen to see anything unusual at my house this morning?" Mrs. Chen looked uncomfortable. I saw some men go to your house, but I thought they were official people. Did you see what they looked like or what kind of car they drove? White, van with some kind of writing on the side. 2 men, one tall and blonde, one shorter with dark hair. They had badges and clipboards. Did you see what happened inside my house? Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears. I saw your wife in the window. She looked scared, but I was afraid to call police. These men, they came to my house last week too. They said if I caused trouble, they would report me to immigration. Jake felt his anger building again, but he kept his voice calm. Mrs. Chen, these men are criminals. They're not real HOA officers and they have no power to report anyone to immigration. Did you happen to see the license plate on their van? I wrote it down, she said quietly. After they left your house, I was so worried I wrote down the number. I thought maybe I should call police later. She disappeared into her house and returned with a piece of paper containing a Virginia license plate number. Jake memorized it. Immediately. Mrs. Chen, thank you. And please don't be afraid to call the police if you see these men again. They're criminals, not officials. Jake visited 4 more neighbors and learned that the fake HOA officers had been working the neighborhood. For weeks, they had targeted houses where they thought the residents would be easy to intimidate, particularly homes where military spouses lived alone during deployments. The Williamses, an elderly couple 3 houses down, had been scammed out of $500 for fake violations. Mrs. Patterson, the actual HOA president, had never heard of any enforcement officers and was horrified to learn that criminals were using the HOA's name. We need to call the police. Immediately, Mrs. Patterson said when Jake explained the situation. I'll handle it, Jake replied, but I need to ask you not to do anything for 24 hours. These men threatened my wife and I want to make sure they can't hurt anyone else before the police get involved. Back at home, Jake used his laptop to research the license plate number. His military security clearance gave him access to databases that ordinary citizens could not use. Within an hour, he had traced the van to a rental company in Norfolk. The van had been rented by a man named Danny Cruz, age 32, with an address in Portsmouth. Jake ran Cruz's name through the criminal database and found an extensive record of fraud, theft, and assault charges dating back 15 years. Cruz's known associate was Pete Williams, age 29, with a similar criminal background. Both men had been arrested multiple times but had never served significant prison time due to plea bargains and overcrowded jails. Jake printed their photos and criminal records, studying their faces until he had memorized every detail. These were the men who had hurt his wife and threatened to come back. He spent the next 2 hours researching their known addresses, vehicles, and associates. Cruz lived in a rundown apartment complex near the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. Williams had no fixed address but was often seen at a bar called Murphy's Tavern in Norfolk. Jake also discovered that Cruz and Williams were part of a larger criminal network that specifically targeted military families. They would watch neighborhoods near military bases, identify houses where spouses lived alone during deployments, and then use various scams to gain access to the homes. The HOA enforcement scam was just their latest technique. Previously, they had posed as utility workers, building inspectors, and even police officers. They had been operating for over 2 years and had victimized dozens of families across Virginia and North Carolina. As Jake read through the case files, his anger turned into something colder and more focused. These men were predators who fed on the vulnerability of military families. They had chosen the wrong family to target. Jake called his friend Tony at the Norfolk Police Department, a former Marine who understood the military community. He explained the situation without mentioning his plans for revenge. Jake, I'm sorry this happened to Lisa. We've been trying to catch these guys for months, but they're careful about not leaving evidence. If you can get us solid proof, we can make arrests. What kind of proof do you need? Either someone willing to testify who saw them commit a crime, or evidence that directly links them to specific thefts. The problem is that most of their victims are too scared to testify. I understand, Jake said. I'll be in touch. After he hung up, Jake sat in his study looking at the photos of Cruz and Williams. Lisa was upstairs sleeping, trusting him to keep her safe. He had failed once, but he would not fail again. Jake began planning his next move with the same methodical approach he used for military operations. He would need surveillance equipment, which he could borrow from his SEAL team. He would need to document the criminal's activities without being detected. And most importantly, he would need to do everything legally so that Cruz and Williams would go to prison for a long time. But first, he needed to make sure they understood that Lisa Morrison was off limits forever. Jake Morrison stepped off the military transport plane at Norfolk Naval Base, his sea bag slung over his shoulder. 6 months aboard the USS Atlantis felt like a lifetime. But now he was finally home. The Virginia sun felt warm on his face as he walked across the tarmac toward the passenger terminal where families waited for their returning sailors. He spotted Lisa before she saw him. His wife stood near the fence, her brown hair catching the afternoon light as she scanned the crowd of sailors. She wore the blue dress he liked, the one that made her eyes look even more beautiful. When their eyes met, her face lit up with a smile that made the long deployment worth every difficult day. "Jake!" Lisa ran toward him, weaving between other reuniting families. He dropped his bag and caught her in his arms, spinning her around, as other sailors and their loved ones did the same around them. "I missed you so much," she whispered against his ear as he held her tight. "I missed you too, beautiful." Jake pulled back to look at her face, studying every detail he had memorized, from photographs during lonely nights on the ship. Something was different, though. There were small lines around her eyes that had not been there before, and her smile seemed forced. They walked hand in hand to the parking lot where Lisa had parked their blue Honda. Jake threw his bag in the back seat and settled into the passenger seat, letting Lisa drive. He had been making life and death decisions for months, and it felt good to let someone else be in control for a while. "How was the neighborhood while I was gone?" Jake asked as they drove through the familiar streets of Virginia Beach toward their home in Pinewood Heights. Lisa's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Oh, you know how it is. Same old stuff. Mrs. Peterson still complains about everyone's lawn, and the Johnsons got a new dog that barks all night." Jake noticed she did not look at him when she answered. In the 5 years they had been married, he had learned to read the small signs that meant Lisa was hiding something. The way she bit her lower lip when she was nervous, how her voice got slightly higher when she was not telling the whole truth. "Everything okay with the HOA?" he asked casually. Fine. Just the usual nonsense about keeping the grass the right height and making sure garbage cans are not visible from the street." Lisa turned on the radio, filling the car with music that made further conversation difficult. Jake decided not to push. Lisa would tell him what was bothering her when she was ready. Right now, he just wanted to enjoy being home with his wife. Pinewood Heights was one of those neighborhoods that looked perfect from the outside. Every house was painted in approved colors. Every lawn was cut to exactly 2.5 inches, and every mailbox was the same style and height. When they had first moved there 3 years ago, Jake thought it looked like something from a magazine. Now, after spending months in places where people fought for basic survival, the perfection felt almost unreal. Their house sat at the end of Maple Street, a modest 2-story home with white siding and black shutters. Lisa had planted a small garden in the front yard before he deployed, filled with flowers that bloomed in different colors throughout the summer. Jake smiled when he saw that she had kept it looking beautiful while he was away. "The garden looks amazing," he said as they pulled into the driveway. "Thanks. I spent a lot of time working on it. It helped me feel less lonely while you were gone." Lisa's voice was soft, and Jake heard the pain in it that she tried to hide. Inside, the house smelled like the vanilla candles Lisa loved to burn. Everything was exactly as he remembered it, from the family photos on the mantel to the stack of books on Lisa's side of the coffee table. She had made his favorite dinner, pot roast with vegetables, and they ate together at the kitchen table while Jake told her stories about his deployment that were not classified. "The guys on the ship would not believe how good this tastes," Jake said, taking another bite of the tender meat. "After 6 months of Navy food, this is like eating at a 5-star restaurant." Lisa laughed, and for a moment she looked like the woman he had married, but then her smile faded and she looked down at her plate. "Lisa, what's wrong? And don't tell me nothing because I know something is bothering you." She sighed and put down her fork. It's just been hard, Jake. Being here alone, dealing with all the neighborhood drama. The HOA has gotten really strict lately. They have these new enforcement officers who come around and inspect everything. What kind of enforcement officers? They just show up and demand to look at your property. They write citations for the smallest things. Mrs. Chen got fined $300 because her garden gnome was 6 inches too close to the sidewalk. The Williamses got cited because their Christmas lights were still up in January, even though half the neighborhood still had theirs up too. Jake felt a familiar tension in his shoulders, the same feeling he got when his SEAL team was walking into a potentially dangerous situation. Have they bothered you? A couple of times. They said our garden was not approved because I did not get permission before planting it. I showed them the HOA handbook and there's nothing in there about getting permission for flower gardens, but they said the rules had changed. Did you talk to the HOA board? I tried, but they said they don't know anything about new enforcement. Officers, Mrs. Patterson, who's the president, seemed as confused as I was. Jake pushed his plate away, his appetite gone. Something was not right about this situation. In his years of military service, he had learned that when something did not make sense, it usually meant someone was lying or hiding something important. These enforcement officers, what did they look like? 2 men, probably in their 30s. One was tall and thin with blonde hair. The other was shorter and stockier with dark hair. They wore official-looking badges and carried clipboards. They said their names were Danny and Pete. Did they give you their full names or any identification besides the badges? Lisa shook her head. I asked to see their IDs, but they said the badges were sufficient. They were pretty rude about it, actually. They made me feel like I was being difficult for asking. Jake made a mental note to look into this situation. Something about these so-called enforcement officers did not sit right with him. He had dealt with enough authority figures in the military to know that legitimate officials were usually willing to provide proper identification and explain their authority clearly. Well, I'm home now, he said, reaching across the table to take Lisa's hand. If they show up again, I'll handle it. Lisa squeezed his hand. I'm just glad you're back. I can handle a lot of things on my own, but dealing with those guys made me feel so helpless. That night, as they lay in bed together, Jake listened to Lisa's breathing as she slept beside him. He stared at the ceiling, thinking about what she had told him. Something was definitely wrong with this enforcement officer situation, and he planned to find out exactly what was going on. 3 days after Jake returned home, he had to report to the base for post-deployment paperwork and debriefing sessions. He kissed Lisa goodbye at 7 in the morning, promising to be home by dinner. I should be back around 6, he said, adjusting his uniform in the hallway mirror. We can order pizza and watch that movie you wanted to see. Sounds perfect, Lisa replied, straightening his collar. Be careful driving. The morning traffic has been crazy lately. Jake grabbed his keys and headed out to his black pickup truck. As he backed out of the driveway, he noticed a white van parked across the street that he had not seen before. 2 men sat in the front seats, but he could not see their faces clearly through the tinted windows. He made a mental note to ask Lisa if she knew who they were when he got home. The drive to Norfolk Naval Base took 45 minutes in morning traffic. Jake spent the time thinking about his conversation with Lisa about the HOA enforcement officers. Something about the whole situation bothered him, but he could not put his finger on exactly what was wrong. At the base, Jake spent the morning filling out forms and attending meetings about his next assignment. The Navy wanted to send him to California for advanced training in 6 months, which would mean another separation from Lisa. He decided to discuss it with her before making any decisions. Around 11:30, Jake's phone buzzed with a text message from Lisa. 2 men here claiming to be HOA officers, being very aggressive. Wish you were home. Jake immediately called her back, but the phone went straight to voicemail. He tried again with the same result. A cold feeling settled in his stomach as he remembered the white van from that morning. Meanwhile, at the Morrison house, Lisa was facing the 2 men Jake had seen in the van. They had knocked on her door 20 minutes earlier, demanding entry, to inspect what they called multiple violations of HOA regulations. Ma'am, we need to come inside and document these infractions. said the taller man with blonde hair who had introduced himself as Danny. He held a clipboard and wore a badge that looked official from a distance. "I'm sorry, but I need to see proper identification first," Lisa said, holding the door only partially open. "And I'd like to call the HOA office to verify that you're authorized to enter my home." The shorter man with dark hair, who called himself Pete, stepped closer to the door. "Lady, we don't have time for this nonsense. We've got 12 other houses to inspect today, and we're already behind schedule. I understand you're busy, but I have the right to verify your credentials before letting you into my home. My husband is in the military, and we take security." "Seriously?" Danny's face hardened. "Your husband isn't here now, is he? And we have full authority from the HOA board to inspect any property in this neighborhood for violations." Lisa felt her heart rate increase. Something about these men made her very uncomfortable, but she tried to stay calm. "If you could just show me some ID with your full names and the HOA contact information, I'd be happy to cooperate." "We showed you our badges," Pete said, his voice becoming more aggressive. "That's all the identification we need to provide. Actually, according to the HOA handbook, residents have the right to see full identification and contact the board to verify any inspection requests," Lisa replied, remembering the exact wording from when she had looked it up after their previous visit. Danny and Pete exchanged a quick look that Lisa did not miss. It was the kind of look that passed between people who were caught in a lie. "Look, lady," Danny said, pushing against the door harder. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way. You're already in violation for that unauthorized garden, and now you're interfering with an official inspection." "I'm not interfering with anything. I'm asking for proper identification, which is my right." Lisa tried to close the door, but Pete stuck his foot in the gap. "Move away from the door, ma'am," Pete commanded, his voice now openly threatening. Lisa's training as a veterinarian had taught her to stay calm in stressful situations. But this was different. These men were not official HOA officers. She was sure of it now. Real officials would not behave this way, and they certainly would not refuse to provide proper identification. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave my property," she said firmly. "If you're legitimate HOA representatives, you can schedule an appointment through proper channels." Danny suddenly pushed hard against the door, causing Lisa to stumble backward. "We're not leaving until we complete this inspection." "Get out of my house," Lisa shouted, reaching for her phone to call 911. Pete grabbed her wrist before she could dial, twisting it painfully. "Drop the phone, lady," Lisa cried out in pain, but held on to the phone. She had not survived 5 years as a military wife to be intimidated by these criminals, because that's what she was sure they were now. "Let go of me," she yelled, hoping the neighbors would hear. Danny stepped fully into the house while Pete struggled with Lisa for the phone. "Just grab whatever looks valuable and let's get out of here," Danny said quietly. Lisa realized these men were not HOA officers at all. They were thieves who had been watching the house, waiting for Jake to leave. The HOA story was just a way to get inside homes and see what was worth stealing. She managed to break free from Pete's grip and ran toward the kitchen, where Jake kept a baseball bat by the back door. But Pete was faster and tackled her from behind, sending her crashing into the hallway wall. Her left wrist hit the corner of a picture frame, sending sharp pain up her arm. "Stop fighting and this will be easier for everyone," Pete said, standing over her. Lisa looked up at him, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead where she had hit the wall. "My neighbors can see you. They'll call the police." "Your neighbors are all at work, and the ones who are home don't want to get involved," Danny said, searching through the living room for items to steal. "We've been watching this neighborhood for weeks." From her position on the floor, Lisa could see Mrs. Chen across the street looking out her window. Their eyes met for a moment before Mrs. Chen quickly closed her curtains. Lisa's heart sank as she realized Danny was right. The neighbors were too scared to help. Pete grabbed Lisa's arm and pulled her to her feet, making her injured wrist throb with pain. "Where do you keep the jewelry and cash?" "We don't keep cash in the house, and my jewelry is just costume stuff," Lisa lied. "Don't lie to us, lady. Military guys always have emergency cash stashed somewhere, and officers' wives always have nice jewelry." Lisa said nothing, which made Pete angry. He shoved her toward the stairs. "We'll start with the bedroom and work our way down." As they forced her upstairs, Lisa tried to think of a way to escape or signal for help. She thought about Jake, probably sitting in some boring meeting at the base, having no idea that his wife was being attacked by criminals in their own home. Danny rifled through their dresser drawers while Pete watched Lisa. He found her jewelry box and dumped the contents on the bed, taking anything that looked valuable. "Not bad," Danny said, pocketing her wedding ring and the pearl necklace Jake had given her for their anniversary. "What about the safe?" "We don't have a safe," Lisa said truthfully. Pete backhanded her across the face, making her ears ring. "Stop lying." "I'm not lying. Check the whole house if you want, but we don't have a safe." The two men spent the next hour going through every room in the house, taking electronics, cash from Jake's emergency fund, and anything else they thought they could sell quickly. They forced Lisa to sit on the couch while they worked, threatening to hurt her worse if she tried to run or call for help. By the time they finished, Lisa's wrist was swollen and painful, her face was bruised from Pete's slap, and she had a cut on her forehead that had stopped bleeding but left dried blood on her cheek. "Remember," Danny said as they prepared to leave, "if you call the cops, we'll be back, and next time we won't be so nice." "We know where you live, and we know your husband's deployment schedule," Pete added. "It would be a shame if something happened to you while he was away again." After they left, Lisa sat on her couch for several minutes, shaking from shock and adrenaline. Then she remembered her phone, which had been knocked under the coffee table during the struggle. She retrieved it with her good hand and tried to call Jake again, but his phone was still going to voicemail. She looked at herself in the hallway mirror and saw a woman she barely recognized. Her face was bruised, her clothes were torn, and her eyes had the hollow look of someone who had just experienced something terrible. Lisa cleaned the blood from her face and tried to figure out what to tell Jake when he came home. She knew he would be furious, and she was afraid of what he might do if he found out the truth about what had happened.